Hey everyone, good afternoon. Welcome, great to see you all here. Thanks for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce Nadja Popovich. Nadja is a graphics reporter and editor at the New York Times. She covers climate science, energy policy, and real-world impacts of our warming world. More focused on climate science up to a couple years ago, and really looking at the energy transition that's happening more recently. Nadja is particularly interested in using interactivity and personalization to help readers more viscerally relate to the effects of climate change through data. Nadja was an interactive reporter at The Guardian previously, focusing on public health, science, and politics. She has won numerous design and journalism awards for her work and contributed to 2 projects honored with Emmy Awards for new approaches to digital storytelling. This event is co-hosted by the Harvard University Center for the Environment at the Salata Institute, as well as the Harvard Data Science Initiative. Apropos of your most recent interests and what you've been reporting on, the talk today is titled Visualizing Climate Change in the Newsroom, how the New York Times brings climate data to life through maps, charts, and other creative visuals, and I think we'll be hearing about the energy transition. Thank you so much for coming, and looking forward to your talk.
Thanks for having me. So yeah, thanks for having me. I'm a reporter and graphics editor at the New York Times. I work on the climate team specifically, and I've been doing that for about 7 years now. I started in 2017 when this iteration of our climate team was first formed. So the Times has had an environment team in the past, and then sort of went to a different model where they kind of distributed environmental reporters all around the newsroom, and then in 2017 they re-centralized again under a new climate team, and that team is under Hannah Fairfield, and she decided pretty early on that the team would not just be more traditional reporters who write about climate change and all the different areas of it, policy and science and lots of other things, but that it would be really important to also have a strong focus on visuals because it would help us tell the story in new and engaging ways. So I specifically work on data visualization. So I wanted to talk a little bit about why data viz is particularly important for or why I view it as particularly important for covering climate change in the news. But just before I get into this, a little bit of background on the team that I'm on. So essentially the Times is very focused on visual journalism, both graphical and other forms. On my team, I work on a smaller team that is the climate team, and there's about a dozen journalists. Some of them are more traditional reporters, and then there's a few of us who are focused on visual specifically. I work on data viz, as I mentioned. Another colleague, Mira Rajanaskal, does the same. We also have another reporter who focuses more on video, photo, multimedia, and illustration. And we also work very widely with the rest of the Times graphics team. It actually has a separate team just dedicated to graphics. Lots of people from that team also collaborate with us. So a lot of the pieces I'm going to be showing and talking about aren't just by me, but lots of people from across the Times. But back to this question, there's a few reasons that I think data visualization is particularly powerful in helping us tell the story of climate change in the newsroom. And the first one is that simply it helps us visualize something that is otherwise invisible. Something that I think is a long-term struggle for the news is how to show climate change and not just tell about it. It's something that is often very difficult to photograph, to take a video of. As many people here probably know, climate change sort of unfolds over very long time spans and often deals in averages and other things that are really difficult to snap a photo of. And I think, but the data can really help us show those trends. Secondly, I find that data visualization can help climate change feel less abstract, something that I'm going to be showing in some of my projects, the ways that we've tried to do that at the Times specifically, but I think it can help readers understand it in a new way that perhaps feels less abstract to them. And lastly, I think that in today's very visual age. I think that it helps draw readers' attention and engagement. I think a lot about how, as you're scrolling through the endless feeds, how sometimes just a really engaging visual is what stops you in your tracks and makes you read a story over another one. And so I think that's really important for having people engage with climate news, which oftentimes can really feel to many readers like, oh, maybe I've heard this before. But if there are interesting new ways that we can really get it in front of readers, that's something that's very important for our team. So I basically structured this talk in a way where I talk through the types of graphics that we do at the Times, but then I'll kind of touch on some of the themes that we also work on through that. But basically, I work on a variety of different things, and my team does as well. There's news graphics, so those are like something happens and we have to, within a day or two maybe, react and create graphics that are often explanatory, in nature, like the second category, but often much shorter term. I consider the thing that I most work on is the second one, which is explanatory visualization. So these are often graphics that have to do with the broader news, but that help explain the context behind it to our readership, and they're usually features, so they take a little bit longer to do. But we also do lots of other different kinds of things. Immersive visualization is another one I will be talking about. These are visualizations in which we really try to make the reader feel like they are experiencing the data themselves. Personalization is something that I have worked on a lot, and that is trying to bring the reader further into the data, help them relate to it, so helping them find themselves in the data and not just thinking about like the bigger picture that it shows. And then I'll also talk a little bit about other things the team has been involved in, including data visual investigations, and we do a ton of multimedia stories. But I'm actually gonna have to exit out of this slide format now because I wanted to actually just go through some of the actual articles to show you guys that. And so I'll start with the kind of news graphics, because these are usually our simpler graphics. There are sometimes charts, maps, other kinds of graphics that we use to cover a new scientific study that comes out, data releases from the government or private groups, sometimes natural disasters, which we often in the climate world, we actually used to cover them a lot more when the Times didn't have a weather team, but for the past 2 years, we've had a weather team, and so now they've taken that over more. But I used to cover natural disasters a little bit, and it was often more of a weather story, but we would also provide the climate context within on which that's happening. And that these stories kind of do, even these stories which are shorter term often do what I was talking about before, like this one, right, helps us visualize something that isn't easy to see otherwise. You can't really take a picture of this, but we have this long-term trend, and we write some version of this article every year when the data comes out at the end of the year, showing how hot the previous year was and putting that in the context of previous years, and this really gives us the climate record and why we know that it's getting hotter over time. So this one was done by my colleague Keith Collins, and it's an article I actually edited because I've also been doing more editing on the team with about data graphics and visuals. Other times we have really been focusing more on lending context around the news. So the marine heat waves and very hot temperatures that we've seen, I think they have persisted for over a year at this point, but this was last summer when this was starting to be a really big story. My colleague Elena Shao, who was a fellow on the climate team at that time and now works on the graphics team at the Times, she did this piece helping put that into context for our readers and helping them understand what it means. And the article has a lot of visuals in it that help you see this trend, but also she did all of the standard reporting practices of talking to experts, understanding what's going on, writing a wonderful article to go along with it. So this is also a big part of our jobs. We really marry the visuals with the kind of narrative reporting that is, what people usually associate with the Times, or at least until recently. I feel like now people really have started to come to the Times for the visualizations as well. And that was something that I had been doing, as I mentioned, more in the past as well. So we looked at all different kinds of events, and this was a set of graphics that I did with a colleague, Tim Wallace, and I wrote the piece that went along with it, looking at this very record-breaking fire season in New Mexico in 2022. And this was mostly a story talking about what was going on at the time. So comparing 2022 to previous years with fire detections, mapping this one monstrously large fire itself and how it progressed and the communities that it impacted. But also, since I work on the climate team, we also really wanted to make sure to provide some of the context behind why this was happening. I think a lot of the time these days, when a major disaster happens, we get questions from readers, like writing in and on Twitter and on other places, asking us, like, well, was this climate change? And we try to put the context into these kinds of stories as well, so we can't say, like, yes, this was climate change, but giving the background to the fact that there's record low precipitation in New Mexico at the time, and then talking to experts who can really round out what this data means for the rest of the piece. And so that's something that we do very often. And these are kind of like the most basic sort of news pieces that we do. But I feel like the kind of bread and butter of what I do, I consider actually this kind of more explanatory visualization. This is something that I've been doing more and more over time. These are pieces that make really complex scientific subjects or policy subjects more accessible by empowering readers to gain a deeper understanding. And I really like these pieces because they also allow me to be a little bit more creative with the type of data visualization I do as well. So one that was fun to do at the end of last year, fun from the data viz side of things, was I actually took a look at how the electric mix has been changing country by country around the world, and I ended up leading that with this chart, which first just shows the global picture. So it shows wind and solar really growing at a very, very strong pace and becoming a large part of the electric mix over the past decade. But as you can see, fossil fuel power is not yet declining. And that was something that our readers also had questions about because we had published some of the wind and solar trends earlier in the year without putting them in this broader context. And people actually wrote in to ask, like, well, what is that doing to fossil fuel power? So that was part of why we wanted to get this in front of people. But as I was digging through the data set, which had country by country trends as well, I started noticing some things and ended up framing the article around this, which is that, okay, so this is the global trend, but it really sort of is made up by two. Oh, you almost can't. Okay, on that screen, you can't see that there's a map in the background there, but there is. It's just light gray. This is a world map. There's like the United States, and over there it's Asia and Africa. But these were just these are bubble charts on top of it showing the trends over the last decade for where electricity, where fossil fuel power had been declining and where it was still rising very quickly. And as you can see, it had been declining sometimes more slowly than policymakers had hoped, but still declining in countries like the United States, many European nations, Japan, but in a lot of quickly growing nations like China, India, other Southeast Asian nations, fossil fuels are still rising very quickly. And so I ended up kind of dividing those trends into groups to help explain to readers what is going on in these different countries and what those different trends mean for the energy transition. So noting things like the fact that there's something similar in all of these countries, which is that while fossil fuel power has been going down, electricity use also isn't rising. Electricity use is basically flat or declining in most of these countries, which has helped that trend as clean power has been increasing. Meanwhile, in places where power demand is still growing very quickly, fossil fuels have kept increasing as well, even in China, which actually has more renewable power, wind and solar at this point than any other country on Earth. And the article mostly went through those things, but what I wanted to make sure to include as well is something that we try to do very often on the Times Climate team, which is a way of exploring the data. So if your country was not one of those ones that we showed in the top charts, which had more of like the narrative structure, we also wanted to let people ask the question, well, what about my country? And so I think, if I'm remembering correctly, that this is like the top, I forgot how many exactly, I think it's the top 50 countries or something like that for that year, for that we had data for 2023. And as part of this, you could like find your own country. I also added these buttons, which are actually like make slightly more sense up here, just for when people ask, well, these are on very different scales, right? How do they compare? I did want to make it very obvious that China is on a very different scale than a lot of these other countries, just because of the sheer amount of power used and created there. And you can do something similar down here as well. But if I only showed it to you this way, right, you basically wouldn't see anything going on anywhere except for China. So that's why we started the data visualization in this way. And I thought this piece was really interesting because you can see lots of different trends that you can find in here, even ones that I don't mention in the article that I just didn't have time to go into. Like you can really see nuclear dominating in France, but you could also see things like Germany taking offline many of its nuclear power plants and the growth of, at the same time as wind and solar was growing. And similar trend in Japan. This was after the Fukushima disaster, which we noted in a couple of notes here, just kind of guiding you through some of the other trends in the data so that people kind of understood what to look for and weren't just thrust into this blind. And I think that's a big part of what we kind of contribute to this as journalists, right, is helping people understand the data as they're going through it and not just kind of throwing them into whatever it might be blind. Other kind of explanatory stories we've done in the recent past. So as Peter mentioned, I've been focusing on the energy transition, so a couple of these will be, I've been focusing on it for the past year and a half, so a couple of these will all be on that theme. But we looked at the question of why am I suddenly hearing about electrifying everything? That was something we thought that we could tackle visually. It had been, again, something that our readers had been noticing. We're writing more and more about EVs and about heat pumps and about other electric appliances and all of these things. And so we wanted them to understand how this is, one of the strategies the U.S. and many other countries have adopted for fighting climate change. And the way we did that is we actually looked at, so first this is data looking at how we use energy today, and then it shows you what percentage of each of those categories is electrified today. So you can see our housing, like residential and commercial, is both more electrified. Transportation, very little is electrified today. And same thing with industry, like different sectors are somewhat more electrified, but mostly it doesn't, it mostly uses natural gas and other energy sources. And for transportation, it's gasoline, oil. And then we also took a look at, this is from a modeling group, what would it take to achieve these goals that the Biden administration has set out? What would it actually mean? How do the models envision us getting there? And what this shows is just a lot more electrification, right? I mean, you look at passenger vehicles, and they would be, I think, 89% would run on electricity when it's less than 1% today. And so that's a huge change. And this visualization was kind of tough, actually, to figure out how to do, because something else happens when you electrify everything, and that is that we use less energy overall. So the circle ends up not being that same sized pie. So I ended up doing this kind of extra layer on the outside to try to remind people of, to try to remind people of the previous graphic and to explain why this one is now smaller, especially when they're not just side by side, which is something that I couldn't do because we designed for mobile first now. So that was something I was keeping in mind when I was trying to design for this graphic. And the rest of the story itself actually kind of now goes through sector by sector, explaining, what we're trying to do and what is tough about getting to that modeled future, right? Because that's a model. It's not what's going to happen, and we use a lot of the kind of words to help explain like what would be needed and what might be tough about getting to that future world. And similarly for the other sectors as well. And then another one that I particularly liked working on last year, this was looking at the question of why it's so hard to build transmission in the U.S. And there were lots of different ways to get into this, but what we try to do very often is really, our audience in the news is probably a little bit different than like audience for scientific papers or others. They are often people who are maybe like aware of this issue but aren't experts in it. So we wanted to start with something that just explains how the energy grid, how the electric grid in the U.S. works in the first place. I think a lot of casual readers don't really know much about that beyond like I turn on my light switch and the lights go on. So we sort of started by visualizing just the sort of imagined grid, if you will. We often talk about the grid. I think a lot of people think about it as one unified machine, but really the U.S. grid is not. There's at least three. There's in reality 3 grids. There's a western interconnection, an eastern interconnection, and Texas. Much of Texas is on its own, but then even within that, there's this patchwork of operators and utilities, all of which have competing interests, and that makes building transmission lines across long distances really difficult. So we wanted to kind of set up the problem in this top graphic by means of explaining to people how it all works. And then again, the article kind of goes into why we need more transmission for the energy transition. And then we, again, looked at some modeling, in this case from NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, just to show the magnitude of change that would be needed if we wanted to achieve these climate goals set out by the Biden administration. This is where we're at today. So this is showing both wind power and solar power and the transmission capacity between regions. So these aren't actual transmission lines, this is capacity between regions. But we thought it was the best visualization to show sort of the magnitude change that would be needed for a future clean electric system. And again, this follows a little bit of the same setup that I talked about before, where we then use the rest of the article to talk about some of the challenges facing the United States in achieving that kind of more interconnected system. Immersive visualization is kind of the third category of stories that we very often do. These help readers more viscerally connect to complex science through like very detailed graphical forms. One of my favorite examples of this is a piece that my colleague Mira Rodnasikal did, I want to say 2 years ago, but time, I'm forgetting, maybe it was a year, I think it was 2 years ago. It was called The Coming California Megastorm, and this piece is wonderful, and I'm going to sort of, in abbreviated form, tell you how she did it, since I didn't make it, but a colleague did. But essentially, this is based on a study that looked at a potential atmospheric river that would deliver a lot of rain to California, partly driven by the increases in atmospheric moisture from climate change. And so, but what was like beautifully rendered about this data is that Mira did it. So she mapped it in this way that is so like pseudo-realistic, right? And it makes you like literally feel as you are scrolling through and learning about it that you are being lashed by the rain at the same time. And it really feels like rainfall, right? She could have made some more abstract charts and some more some more abstract maps as well, but I think she spent the time to really do this very detailed representation of this data in a way that I think really matches people's mental model of rain, and I think that made the graphic much more powerful and much more immersive. And I'll just kind of scroll through the rest of it as it keeps going, but the piece also made use of a couple of other forms that I think contributed to that, including she actually worked with our 3D team as well, which is a separate, there we go, okay, which is a separate team under the graphics department, to create some other kinds of graphics that show the idea of how much more rain would be experienced under this modeled scenario than a normal heavy downpour. And I love this visualization that they made here because they could have just shown, even just showing it raining like this is a pretty complex visual, but they added this little umbrella in the middle that invites you to think of yourself under the umbrella there and think about what it would be like to be in rainfall like this. And I think that then pulls people further into the understanding of this data through the experience of everyone has been in a heavy rainfall before, and so they can think about it and how much more this would actually be. Another piece that I worked on in this kind of immersive mode was a reconstruct of how the Dixie Fire, which was a massive wildfire a few years ago in California, how it actually ended up creating its own weather. So it actually kicked up a pyrocumulonimbus cloud, which then kind of kept a feedback loop with the fire itself driving the fire. And this was something that was, relatively new, seeing many of these kinds of very intense literal firestorms. And we had found some research by a professor at the University of Nevada that we thought was very interesting. He had been using radar data, and it's 3D radar data, so it's sort of these slices of one of these clouds that you can see through radar at various altitudes. And he had been using it to reconstruct what the plume looks like, but he had been doing it in 2D. But I worked with this wonderful team, which was also from our, the Times has lots of journalists who contribute in many different ways. Some people code, some people make maps, some people write, and some people can do incredible data analysis. And so I'd worked with this very large team on this piece, which allowed us to actually take that 3D data and reconstruct it into a moment by moment reconstruction of the storm, which sort of shows how it formed. And I sort of led the story form of this project with another colleague, Noah, and the two of us together, and then I wrote through it, and the two of us together and working with the scientists found ways to basically moment by moment tell the story of how this fire created the storm and what that means. And it really pulled people in much closer to an event like this than you would ever be able to get from just a video or photos or anything else, which we had seen a ton of video and photo taken of it from afar, but this really allowed readers to get really up close to it in a way that I think was very, that basically made them be pulled into a story, essentially a science story about how these clouds form and what they can mean. And I thought this was a really interesting one to work on because we also worked with some folks out of who work with 3D video and 3D rendering, and while this looks somewhat like a video, it is actually a data visualization of 3D radar data, but just skinned to look more like the actual cloud itself. Yeah, okay. I'm not going to show actually the third one this time because it kind of is similar to the rest, but my colleagues worked on a great piece about the San Francisco fog that also used many of these same strategies in order to more effectively present the data to our audience. But I wanted to talk a little bit also about personalization because this is something that is very close to my heart. I think it's something that we've done very often on the climate team at the New York Times to help readers really find themselves in the data in hopes of offering them a new way to understand it. So in this case, we take a data set and think about how we can first help readers locate themselves in it before showing them the bigger picture, instead of the more standard view, which is showing them the bigger picture and then having them ask us, well, what about me? Like, what does this mean for my area or my region? The piece, this was a piece that is probably the most read piece, I believe, that our team has ever published. And that was true as of last time I gave a presentation, and I'm pretty sure it's still true. But this was one that we did in 2018, and it was looking at, it was using a climate model to ask the question of how much hotter is your hometown than when you were born. So it actually, when you get on this page, it there's nothing there. It invites you to offer just a little bit of information before you get any sort of data visualization. And so I grew up in Washington. I'm going to put in a random birth year. And yeah, so it then walks you through a couple of steps. There's also some grid lines on there that you can't see, but that's okay. You can see the important part. So it says when you were born, the DC area could expect about 13 days per year to reach at least 90 degrees. And this line that we're drawing in is actually a moving average, a 10-year moving average, because obviously year-to-year data would be much noisier. We wanted to focus on the climate signal rather than the kind of year-to-year variability. But this is average number of days over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. It then draws in more of that line to show how things have warmed so far. So today, the DC area can expect 30 days at or above 90 degrees per year on average. And then we kind of have this third step, which is what my boss loves to call a reveal, where the scale changes and it shows you one possible future. And this is based on some modeling done by Climate Impact Lab. They helped us get this data in shape to be able to do a graphic like this. And this shows how heat might increase, how those 90-degree days might increase in the future under one climate scenario. And then, of course, showing that kind of uncertainty range too, because there is uncertainty when we model the future. And we did this. We actually picked the kind of 80 age as well, because that was average life expectancy in the U.S. at the time, just as a way of having a future point that people can perhaps relate to a little bit better than just when you say like out to 2100, which is usually the modeling that we do. We still show it out further, but we wanted to keep this graphic really contained to a person's lifespan so that they can feel a little bit more connected to it. And shortly after, and here we kind of explain like what the data means and what kind of model we use. This reflects RCP, like a RCP 4.5 modeling, so it's actually a slightly more optimistic actually view. And if you were to look at a different climate model, you might actually get even more warming than seen here. We explain all this in the text, but then come back pretty quickly to the global view, because obviously climate change is global, and we wanted to remind people once they were already immersed in this, in what might happen in their region, that obviously if you're in DC, you probably aren't going to see some of the biggest impacts of climate change. So we then take people on this global tour and are able to convey what it might be like in some other regions across the world, not just their own. And the idea behind this piece is that people have seen the average projections and the average numbers a lot. We had visualized them before ourselves. So we wanted to try to put something in front of readers that kind of flipped that idea on its head, that starts with your local picture and then zooms out to that global, to what's going to be happening globally. And we explain more of the impacts and all of those things around the world in the text. But we found that this was a very, very effective way of having people relate a little bit more to a data set like this. And so it's something that we've tried to do with other visualizations as well. Whenever we get a highly detailed data set, we explore maybe not whenever, but often when we get a highly detailed data set, we try to explore whether something like this might be possible and whether it's effective. So we've done it a couple of times. Otherwise, there is a piece that we worked on with some researchers out of UC Berkeley looking at emissions footprints of the average household. So this kind of was another chance to be able to show people something about their city. In this case, it was just the U.S. Here, we actually wanted to start with some of the patterns across the U.S. to establish this is similar. In many cities across the U.S., you kind of keep seeing this pattern of like the inner, denser neighborhoods where people drive less, and inner parts of cities are often the ones that have lower impacts, whether it is New York, where this effect is greatest, or Atlanta or Las Vegas or many other cities. It just kind of keeps repeating. And we kind of walk you through one example with New York as well, but we eventually actually had this explore your own map that then allows you to pick lots of different areas, and you can see it for yourself, and you can even zoom in and kind of explore different neighborhoods. And we reveal a little bit more about the data as well on Hover, where you can see like what is really driving those emissions. So we're looking at like these are the categories that went into the model that created the mapped data set, and so we reveal a little bit more about it as you go to other areas. And you can see often the further out you go, the more it's like larger homes that require more heating and electricity and longer commutes and driving times, and so those sorts of things really go into this. And we've done it with other sorts of data as well. So this was looking at pollution related, but not directly climate change. So this was our kind of way of doing this. This piece actually should, although I think my computer constantly thinks that I'm in New York because I'm on a VPN, but it usually geolocates you to your own location. And so we looked at the worst day of air quality in different cities. We looked them up for different cities around the world off of a data set. I believe this one was from Berkeley Earth, and visualize and tell you what the worst day of air pollution is in where you live. And then use that as a way of getting into a comparison with some of the worst events that we've seen across the news in recent years. So this was back when the California wildfires were turning the skies orange, and we wanted to put that in context. And it was just a couple of months after New Delhi had, I think, recorded one of the highest ever readings. And so we did this version for online, and it has lots of other visualizations in it, including a map of PM 2.5 trends and some more charts comparing different areas, and that also show you like the yearly trends. So for instance, the wildfires in San Francisco really only increase pollution during one part of the year, but the rest is relatively low pollution, whereas if you compare Boston to something like New Delhi, you can see that the pollution is much, much, much worse in New Delhi year-round. And so that top piece, again, kind of uses that personalization to draw people into the story before we give them other ways to explore the issue. But what I loved about this piece is that we also got to try out other mediums, not just a New York Times article, but actually this was again the 3D team, but they were exploring some augmented reality versions of things. So we actually built, and by we I mean mostly Kartik, built the same version of that topper that we had done for the online piece, but that you could use through the Instagram app, and actually it showed you all three cities, although he only recorded New Delhi here. And you could actually feel like you were walking through it and like you were actually engaging with the pollution in your space. And and it was based on basically the same data that we had used in the previous piece, but rendered into a 3D space. And this reached like a completely different set of people often than our article itself did. And so that was a really nice way of exploring how else we can maybe reach readers who otherwise wouldn't engage with an article about global pollution. And lastly, I just want to also talk about two other things that we often do in order to visualize climate change in our newsroom. We've been doing more data and visual investigations. In this case, we are spending a lot more time. These are probably the longest term projects that we do to uncover new data or other visual evidence of climate and environmental harms. And in this case, we did a huge series last year. This was run by my colleague Mira as well, on groundwater. And what they ended up doing, and I think we were working on this for about 6 months, but essentially they were trying to find a national data set of groundwater depletion and just couldn't find it anywhere. Like all researchers they talked to at the USGS, at universities, other places were like, oh, we can give you data for Texas, or we can give you data for California, but there's no national data set. You won't find that. And then as they were talking to more people, they realized there were these state data sets, and then finally, I think they found that there was I forgot now because again, this was my project, it was Mira's, but they either found an API or some other thing that the USGS had where they could query national data, but through like lots of different points for different states. And they actually ended up bringing all of that together with all of the state data that they had gotten from various states, and I think some FOIAs, and creating for the first time like something even many researchers told them they had never seen, which is a national map of trends in groundwater level over time for the entire contiguous United States. And it was a big team effort. Mira worked with a few folks from the graphics department and some reporters from our team, and this ended up driving, I think, a multi-part series. I can't remember exactly how many parts now, over the entire year last year. And it was kind of one of our signature series for the year, and it was all basically made possible by the fact that now we have people in the newsroom who can do lots of different things, and not necessarily just the traditional reporting, but also we have people who can script and visualize and do a lot of back-end data analyses, and it allows us to just do a lot more complex pieces with data than we were able to in the past. And then this piece is actually a good transition for my next section, where I'm just going to briefly talk about kind of non-data data visualization pieces. This is another kind of investigative piece that my colleague Hiroko Tabuchi did, where they ended up getting a camera that can, an infrared camera that can see methane leaks, and they were able to then tell the story of these leaks in a much more visceral way than if they had just written about it without being able to see it, because again, this kind of gets into the just taking a photo versus being able to visualize in a different way. Like, this is what it looks like if you're just looking at it with the naked eye, but the infrared camera sees something very, very different. And so that was another creative way that I think she worked on this in collaboration with Jonah Kessel, I believe, yes, who is from our video team. And they spent a bunch of time out actually like shooting all of this and being able to show to our readers how methane escapes, what it actually looks like if you were looking at it a different way. And then that made the broader story a lot more powerful around these leaks. And that is my kind of segue into the last bit, which is that I will just say that data viz isn't always the best way, the best visual way to tell a story. We also rely on high quality photography and video, and often even illustrations and other different work that I haven't even shown yet. And often we'll pair it with maps and graphics or see if there's some creative way to do these things, but I find that these kinds of pieces are equally effective often at really kind of bringing readers along the journey of the story itself. This one I just wanted to highlight because I'm extremely jealous of it. Basically, a colleague of mine got, Ray, who covers climate science for us, got to go on this expedition, rafting, I believe, 2 weeks in the Grand Canyon with some scientists, and but they had exactly one slot on the raft, and we couldn't even bring a photographer or anything. So Ray like borrowed a bunch of photo equipment and video equipment from our video team, and they told him to be very careful with it in a raft. And he actually did all of the photography in this piece and the videography, and wrote the whole piece and reported it at the same time. And that's, again, just kind of like a very new skill set to have someone who can do all of that at the same time. And I think it turned out great. And we have one very beautiful map showing the kind of region, but mostly this is told through these very stunning photos and beautiful words woven together. And we did that a little bit last year too. This was a series that I was the project manager for, where we looked in a couple of pieces where the U.S. energy transition really stands today. And the first piece was looking at how in many parts of the country things are moving faster than many people realize today. And again, it was largely actually told through these like beautiful photos. We sent one photographer out across all of the pieces, but it also has a couple of quite sparse graphics that I made just to kind of help explain some of the points being made in the piece about, for instance, the growth of solar and wind power, and further down we have some on electric vehicles and other things, but mostly the power of this piece. And again, this was an extremely popular piece for us last year, one that was highly read. I think a big power of it is these like very beautiful close-up images that this photojournalist was able to get to really help convey the energy transition today in a way that does still feel new and does feel like things that people haven't seen before. Yeah, but that's all I have today. So thank you all very much, and I'd be glad to take some questions now. I think that's
Thanks so much for the behind-the-scenes kind of view on so many of these articles that I've read and really found fascinating, and to hear more about them is wonderful. I'm sure there's a lot of questions. Go ahead. Yeah.
How do you measure the success of which articles are like resonating with people and which ones are not?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of, so in case everyone heard, how do we measure success? I think there's a couple ways we measure success. I mean, the kind of crudest and most easiest is page views. So we have like a back-end tool that lets us see how many people are actually reading with it. And then we can also immediately see reading time, so time on page, like how long people are spending with it, I think is often more indicative of engagement than just whether they clicked on it or not. And then there's kind of sub areas of all of that that you can get into, including like how they got there. So we'll often look at like, do we see that everyone is just coming from our homepage, or are they coming from other places where it means that it was shared more widely than just with our core audience? And there's other metrics that we can kind of track, but I think, that's kind of the core, but then I think a lot of the way that I look at, especially some of the like more personalized pieces, we will often, although less and less because social media I feel like is changing a lot, but we used to see a lot people like literally just taking screenshots and tweeting or posting to Facebook or wherever else with their city or their town. Like I was just trying to look up that your city's climate footprint piece and found just like, I think there's like a Reddit thread for like 10 different cities that someone just screenshot their city and then was like, here's a picture, discuss. And I think that's really interesting, and that's something that like you really see very more often with pieces like that, where people feel like they can dig into the data themselves and like discover more for themselves and not just see what we told them to see and show. And so for me, like that's kind of success, right? That people like keep looking at it and are looking at it from different angles and not just necessarily looking on it at the New York Times either, even though that's something that our metrics aren't going to pick up. Like a lot of times they post it even without a link, so no one's coming back to us for that. But I actually think it's kind of like a success for the piece, right?
This kind of ties to the question, but do you feel like the vis gives them like a longer shelf life, I guess? Like, do you see any evidence that months later people still go to these stories and see them?
Yeah, definitely. I think it does give a lot of these stories a longer shelf life, especially because a lot of the stories that I work on are this kind of more like feature or explanatory journalism nature, and they sort of hold up even like a year or two or longer down the line, and so it's nice to see people keep coming back to them for that reason. I think, sometimes I have done more news and stuff, and people do, even if it's visual, people don't come back to that as often, because usually it's just the kind of event, and there's a lot of interest around the event, and then it moves on. But I think the combination of the kind of explanatory featuresy material with like a more memorable visualization does keep people coming back more often, which is nice, and hopefully like new audiences as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, thank you. This is just wonderful. And I teach things here where I would love to use pieces of this. And of course, I see these articles, and sometimes I remember to save them, and sometimes I don't. And I'm just curious how much kind of curation is there of, like, I would love your presentation, but no, is there some place online where all of these things are kept together, and can people get some of the data and some of the visualizations to sort of start where you left off, from a code or data point of view?
Yeah, so unfortunately they're not really kept anywhere that's like all together. We've talked about this a lot, that there are probably much better ways for us to like help people find these kinds of pieces, whether or not they're visual, just in general, or kind of like we do lots of explanatory journalism, and just in general, how do you navigate people back to that more even within the Times, let alone outside of the Times. So it's something we're working on trying to answer, but right now there's not like a great place beyond like my byline page or like Mira's byline page.
What about like just the data, it's like that groundwater thing that you showed where you said, this unique compilation.
Yeah, so for a really long time that was on, that has a landing page of its own. So I think if you search groundwater New York Times, that'll pop up, and all the stories are on there, and there's more visual ones than just this one. This was just the first kind of big story that they published. So sometimes we'll do things like that, and I think the like energy transition series as opposed to general coverage area that they did last year also has one like that. But if you're just kind of looking for like graphics on environment and climate, there's not one good place for those, but we're thinking about it and hoping to do that. And the second part of your question about we don't actually share our data publicly, mostly because we're just not set up for it whatsoever, and that would require. Basically, we found that maintaining a public data set just requires a lot of work, and for instance, there's 2 of us on the climate team, and that would take up probably more time than we're able to.
There could be a partnership with somebody.
We're able to have. But the Times has released data in the past for things like with a very large public interest, like the COVID tracking data and things like that. So there's definitely precedent, but we haven't managed to convince our editors ever that it would be a good idea for some of the climate stuff. But if there's anything you're interested in, we can talk and see what is possible. Yeah. Also, a lot of the stuff I work on, especially like the non-investigative stuff, often the data does come from like scientific papers or like government organizations, and so then that would just be available in that format.
Thanks for the presentation. I was wondering, a lot of the modeling that you're using relies on a certain like pathway, right? A certain emissions pathway. Do you always use like RCP 4.5, or how do you decide which model you're going to present to readers? And then once you decide which model you're going to present, like how do you explain that? Do you call it like a mid pathway, or like have you standardized that across your climate desks?
Yeah, so we have used RCP 4.5 a lot, partly because we found that after, like, I don't know, probably around when I started and a little bit later than that RCP 8.5, which is usually there's not very many pathways that scientists make available, like especially back in 2017. I feel like now you often get more options. Back in 2017, maybe like once in a while you would get 2, and that would be great, and they would usually be 4.5 and 8.5, and maybe sometimes 3, and then there would be like a lower end pathway as well. We have a couple of times tried to show more than one as a way of getting at uncertainty. So I was saying this to someone earlier at lunch, like we did a piece, actually like a first version of the How Hot Is Your Hometown piece was just mapping, like no personalization, like just mapping when the data first came out, looking at how heat would spread around the world. So it was just a global map and you couldn't zoom in, nothing like that. And that one showed both RCP 8.5 and 4.5, kind of as a way of showing uncertainty. Like, it's hard to map uncertainty, and one way you can do it is to show that there is not one map, there's not one future, right? But that there's multiple answers. So we did that in that piece, and we've done that a couple of times, but very often I've just found that it's usually more effective visually, like if there's either not that big a difference between two, or if like the difference is harder to explain than it is actually helpful for a reader, then we usually pick one, and we've erred on the side of kind of 4.5 versus 8.5 because I think it's, as long as it feels effective, and we usually speak to experts and make sure that everything feels like okay about that, but we have done that in the past because it felt a little bit easier to err on the side of like, even this big increase is hopefully positive, actually, and it could be worse than this, rather than showing the worst, kind of the worst case scenario, and then people's answer being like, well, it's not going to be this bad, right? So that's why we've usually chosen 4.5, even though it's a more optimistic scenario than the trend we're particularly exactly on right now. But yeah, that would, sorry, was there a second part to that question?
I was also wondering how you talk to readers about 4.5.
Yeah. So in the case of the How Hot Is Your Hometown piece, I believe that we call, I mean, I can pull it up. It's here right now. Instead of saying I believe that we called it. Yeah. So it was like, even if likely to feel this heat, even if countries take action to lower their greenhouse gas emissions by the end of the century. So kind of just explaining what it means is what we've kind of settled on. And then, saying something like, if countries continue emitting at historically high rates, which was our allusion to 8.5, the future could be even hotter. And so we've tried various different ways to explain this. Sometimes I think we've said something like roughly in line with the Paris commitments, like things like that. But we mostly have just tried to kind of explain what it is without getting into like very specific scenarios underpinning it, just because, again, for like an average reader, what do they need to know? And it's essentially that this is a somewhat optimistic pathway that we're showing them, even though they see that rise.
Now I see that there's a lot more questions than there is time, unfortunately. But maybe I could just take the prerogative to ask one last question.
Sure.
Because in the last 10 years, there's been the kind of revolutionary steps taken to be able to do digital storytelling. Where do you see it going in the next 10 years?
Oh, the hardest question. What I've seen, just like even in recent years, is just like a truly large expansion of what we're able to do online, like the kinds of graphics we're able to do. I mean, that like Dixie Fire graphic where we like in 3D visualized, like recreated a fire cloud and visualized it and got it to work on your phone, like seems like no way we could have done that even 5-6 years ago. And I think more and more we're able to do things like that, and that's both a combination of tools that are available to us, internal tools that we've made at the Times, and just like the availability of different kinds of data. I think we're just seeing more and more data become available from satellites, from science, from lots of different areas, and I think that has really been pushing what we're able to do so far. And in my mind, there's been a real acceleration kind of from a couple of charts to we're recreating a 3D fire cloud. And if I don't know what's in store for the future, but if it keeps going at this rate, I think we're just going to see like many new forms that we might otherwise not have even been able to imagine yet. And I think that's pretty exciting. So I hope that is true. I hope that we don't hit some kind of ceiling that I'm not imagining.
Well, thanks so much for sharing your work with us.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me.
much.